So I'm with HPE, and I will talk to you about core network and the evolution with 5G. Topic of conversation is islands and bridges, so let's start by defining what do we mean by islands here. Islands of deployment is nothing new in this industry. We've had multi-vendor networks since a long time, but the way we're doing this is about to change. So in the past, when we did multi-vendor network, typically we agreed which vendor was going to do which network function. We'd implement the network function, and we do a standards-based interoperability testing pretty much at the functional level, and you were ready to execute the end-to-end network service. With NFV already, we were trying to change this approach, right? So if you go back a couple of years, we said with NFV, we're going to do major changes in the way we implement networks. We're going to have an infrastructure layer separated from the software layer. We're going to introduce new vendors. This was definitely one of the objectives, as over time, the number of network equipment providers has reduced significantly. And we're going to foster innovation by bringing in these new entrants and lowering the barrier to entry in general to get into the telco core network. Unfortunately, today, I think it's pretty obvious that we have not achieved all of those objectives. We have probably achieved partially the first one, reducing the cost by separating hardware from software and putting a squeeze on the infrastructure providers, including HPE. But the number of new equipment providers in most networks and the amount of innovation that has happened has been fairly limited, as most operators have stepped back and actually went with a silo approach and took everything top to bottom from a single vendor. Now in 5G, we're coming with this notion of cloud-native applications, and we're talking about having a service-based architecture, and all the expectation in terms of innovation is there again, and it's probably even more important than it was in the past. Because now the expectation is how to monetize 5G is by going into industry vertical. And industry vertical, by definition, means we need to bring in different expertise. And the people that are coming with the industry vertical expertise that we need, they're used to doing things in a different way. They're used to working with open source technologies. They're used to working with different development methodologies that we as an industry have to adapt. We have to become less special. We have to embrace more elements out of the standard IT industry and make this something that is more common and more recognizable for people coming from outside of the industry. As a side benefit, what we are seeing is that as multiple vendors like ourselves, we are going through this change, we recognize that there are a set of open source tools out there that we can leverage from the IT industry that are defining the operational model of our network functions. And as we do this, we find that the partners we are working with, people like Samsung, Affirmed, OpenNet, Metaswitch, Casa Systems, we are adopting the same kind of open source technologies. So the operational framework we are embracing tends to be rather similar, which means that by the time it gets to you as an operator, it actually looks and feels much more as a single solution than it did in the past. The other type of islands we are used to, which is probably a little bit more tactical because it's a transitionary period, is the need to bridge between what is initially going to be islands of 5G deployment in a sea of 4G. At the same time, we have a hurricane, a veritable whirlwind of changes happening still in the standardization body. So release 15 was great because it allowed us to get started, defining non-standalone, standalone, defining the network elements, but there were still a lot of elements that were not defined in 3GPP release 15 that needed to be resolved in 16. By our count, there's close to 400 different work items that have been addressed in release 16, two of which are particularly important for the topic I introduced on the previous slide. One is UDICOM. So UDICOM is really about the interworking between HSS and UDM in order to have a single subscriber experience as we go from one network to the other. Historically, this has been a challenge in past generations of networks, and we as a company actually benefited from this because we've been able to implement solutions to help resolve this. But typically, if you take a core network, a Packard core from one vendor, and an IMS overlay from another vendor, keeping consistency in the subscriber profile, keeping consistency in the supplementary service that were introduced has been a problem. So UDCOM is intended to provide a standards-based approach to resolve this. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. Similarly, on 5G, in release 15, we introduced the notion of a UDSF. UDSF is the unstructured data storage function. It is a critical network element in order to achieve cloud native. If you remember, one of the principles of cloud native is the separation of call processing and data, which means that you need to store the data somewhere. And in release 15, we introduced UDSF as an area, as a function in which you could store session data, VNF states, so that the network functions, the other network functions, the AMF, the SMF, the AUSF, the UDM, etc., could focus just on the call processing and become truly stateless cloud-native network functions. The problem is that in release 15, we did not specify what is the API for UDSF. So without a proper specification of the API, of course, this tends to become a proprietary implementation, and you lose the benefit of having a common infrastructure that is accessible to all, including, again, the people that are coming from outside the industry that don't necessarily have the skills and expertise to build highly available, resilient, telco-grade applications. But by separating the call processing from the shared data layer, you actually don't need to, because what they need to focus on is providing the value, that is the knowledge of the call processing, the knowledge of the function that needs to be implemented, while the UDSF coupled with the UDR is taking care of the hard work of making it a telco-grade application. So when we look a little bit more onto both of these topics, so the UDCOM, again, the objective of UDCOM is to unify subscriber profile and service experience across multiple networks. In this discussion, this is a critical battleground that decides whether or not you can introduce multiple vendors into your network. Why? In these discussions, there were 6 different solutions proposed. Many of those solutions actually assumed a proprietary interface between 4G and 5G. What does this mean? It means that whoever owns your 4G core network today will be, by default, your 5G network provider. You don't want that. You want choice. And so what we fought for, together with a number of operators, and successfully so, was to introduce a solution that is standards-based. If you go into the specs, you will find something that is called Solution 2, that is defining a leg from 5G into the HSS, so that you can have simultaneous registration in 4G and 5G. Okay, I don't want to go into the technical details. I'm very happy to discuss this on our booth, but it's important to understand that there is a standards-based approach that you can take to your existing 4G vendor and force to adopt in order to give you the choice to go with somebody else in 5G without having to do a full-scale migration from 4G, your current 4G vendor, to somebody else. On the service-based interface and the introduction of UDSF, I already explained the importance in terms of application development and giving your people that are coming from the industry verticals access to the skills and capabilities that we have in telco. But there's another benefit. The other benefit is that as we deploy networks, we expect them to be highly dynamic. We expect to be able to move workloads around. We expect to be able to spin up instances, shut them down. By having this separated data storage, we are making our lives a lot easier on the operations on a day-to-day basis. The moment you want to deploy a network function closer to the edge, as long as the shared data layer is already instantiated at the edge, you will have the information you need in order to get the application workload up and running. All the subscriber information, all the contextual information will be there. Similarly, there's a benefit in terms of scaling. One of the things that we have seen when we started doing NFV, we were decomposing applications into a load balancing layer, a call processing, and a storage layer. One of the reasons we did this is the load balancing was hiding complexity from the network. But the load balancing needed to be context aware, and we needed to route the call to the right call processing instance. Now that we have cold processing instances that are stateless, in fact, you don't have to worry about routing to the right instance because any instance is capable of taking any message for any ongoing session. By the way, just coming back on the topic of why you need a multi-vendor approach, we already explained in NFV why we wanted to do this, right? Open up the ecosystem, drive innovation. In recent times, in the past 6 months or so, there have been a number of papers coming out from the Department of Defense in the US. Now there's one from the EU that came out last week, citing security concerns. Security concerns because 5G is going to be much more important even than 4G for the overall economy, and people are worried about security vulnerabilities. And I would say there are probably two main worries. One is having an over-reliance on a single vendor. It means that if there's a security flaw in the software of that vendor, you're wholly dependent on their ability to fix the security flaw. And the other one is just the geopolitical situation that we have today, which, like it or not, is affecting decisions, vendor decisions, even today, as there is a risk that if you choose the wrong vendor, you may be forced to make expensive changes simply because somebody somewhere has decided that you do not use a vendor from a specific country. Okay? But I think the important thing for me is still the fact that you do need to change. You do need to introduce new vendors in order to have the innovation, in order to monetize the network. So I would like to focus on the positive rather than the external constraints. So what can you expect from Hewlett Packard Enterprise? We have been in core network since 20, 30 years as an established provider of HLR, HSS. So obviously, we have the 2G, the 3G, the 4G, the IMS, the AAA, et cetera, et cetera. And we are implementing the 5G functions, and we are adopting the standards-based interface that I just described with UDICOM in order to make 4G and 5G into working work. We are also providing the underlying shared data layer that allows you to have something that we'd like to call mixed vendor rather than simply multi-vendor, in the sense of having a deeper element of integration between the different network vendors. So we do provide this shared data capability, and we do build on top of that our own cloud-native stateless network functions. So all of our network functions for 5G have been built from the ground up, leveraging open source components where possible, completely stateless, containerized micro-functions. Then, I cannot preach an approach to go multi-vendor without doing some work on my side to make your life a little bit easier, because of course you do not want the integration to happen on your doorstep. It needs to be done prior to getting into your networks. As a company, Hewlett Packard Enterprise has always worked to create open standards, to open up the markets and then compete within. And in that doing so, we've always worked with partners. If you look at the infrastructure, we have technology partners like Intel, AMD, Red Hat, VMware. If you look at the application space, we're working with people like Affirmed, Samsung, OpenNet, Casa, Metaswitch, you name it. And we are in their labs, and they are in our labs, working together to make sure that the applications work seamlessly together and making sure that it works on the infrastructure. Finally, the piece that I'm not going to talk about today, simply because it's a big topic in and of itself, and we have other slots where we've been talking about this, service and slice orchestration. As we are decomposing the network in micro-functions, we already saw when we moved from appliance to NFV, my appliance-based HLR was a couple of servers, big beasts, but just a couple of servers. Doing the same thing in a virtualized was already scaling us to about 50 network functions, 50 VNFCs rather, VNF instances. Doing the same in micro-functions based is going to be an order of magnitude increase again. Plus the dynamicity of being able to scale in, scale out, and move workloads around. Unless we have a very high degree of automation, we will not be able to manage these kind of networks. So service and slice orchestration are extremely important. First of all, just to maintain the ability to manage a network in efficient and keeping control over your OpEx. And then as a second instance, in order to give you the dynamicity that allows you to monetize 5G. Finally, This is not something that is just a dream. This is something that is real. We are, as I mentioned before, in labs with our partners. This is something that we've been doing in Samsung labs in Korea, Suwon. Since about a year now, we are integrating the various components from HPE, from OpenNet, from Samsung, all leveraging the same shared data layer capability, all aligning on the same platform as a service, open source components. And this is something that is real today, that is demonstrable, and we will bring out a press release in the next couple of weeks where you will find more information. We are doing similar activities with other partners like Affirmed, Casa Systems, Metaswitch. So we are doing the hard work of making this easy for you before it comes to your networks. With that, I think I actually managed to gain you guys a couple of minutes of the time that we have lost this morning. If there are any questions, I'm very happy to talk to you in our booth at B10 for any further questions. With that, thank you very much.